Welcome back to another episode of Hungry for the Word. As always, I'm your host, Tommy Vento, with my lovely co-host, Julie Vento. Today, we would like to talk about the early rains and the late rains. This is coming from the book of James, chapter 5, verse 7. Specifically, I'll say for the wording, but kind of weaving a couple different lessons together. And it was interesting as I brought this up for what was on my heart. The same verse is also on your heart, but for a different reason. And so
Hmm.
we'll talk a little bit about both of those, I think, today. Um, and I suppose without further ado, let's read the verse and then we can dive right into what it made us both think of. Um,
Yeah.
so this is again James chapter 5, verse 7. Be patient, therefore, beloved, until the coming of the Lord. The farmer waits for the precious crop from the earth, being patient with it until it receives the early and the late rains. You must also be patient. Strengthen your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is near. And that's James, for being a relatively short book, is packed to the gills with wisdom. And he's talking specifically in this section about wisdom and really just letting wisdom run its course. So, as we talk about the early and the late rains, is there anything that sticks out to you?
Well, uh, first of all, yeah, I love the book of James. I've heard it referred to as the Psalms of the New Testament,
Mm,
um,
interesting.
or Proverbs and Psalms of the New Testament, because it is just packed full of wisdom. Um, but yeah, when I think of the early and late rains, I mean, I think of the harvest where, the early spring rains and the late fall rains.
Mm,
Um, but I'm not sure if it's always necessarily a time frame here, but
right. Yeah, it's funny you say that. It as everything is with the Lord, it's multi-layered. And
mhm.
oftentimes, the deeper you peer, I think that hint, this is kind of a sidebar, but I suppose it's related um, in the sense of what we're talking about. But the analogy, if you will, that the Lord gave us with it's both an analogy and literally how it's made of the atom that forever we just thought things were things. And then one day we were sitting around and said, well, what makes wood and what makes this metal? What's in it? And theorized and eventually proved the atom. And we were like, okay, that's the smallest structure in the world. And then we realized that the atom is made up of parts. And then actually, those parts are made up of parts. And the deeper you go, the more the universe on that level expands. And it's the same way with the Lord's teachings. And that's part of what to me the early and the late rains represents. Like you said, it sometimes is a time frame. It sometimes literally is be patient. Like you just asked for this. Things gotta take time. I'm like, God's like, I
Yeah.
gotta set it up for you, bud. But the outside of it being, a physical time frame, the representation of the early and the late rains for, I'll say what's on my heart right now is, we talked in the last couple of episodes about Ephesians 4, and that's where we get the idea. Well, one of the times we get the idea of putting off the old man and put on the new. And there have been many times, I'll say, especially early in the journey, but still it happens this long in. And I'm sure for you, 30 years
Still
on the journey,
does.
it still
Yep.
happens where you get to a lesson and you feel on some level, I've done this before. I've put
Hmm.
that off before. But we faced this. We talked about this. And I think the early and the late rains is just representative of two teachings to me going on at the same time. Number one, you are made in the Lord's image, so you are divinely patient. And part of that divine patience means putting it to practice. And so he's not punishing you, he's not holding out on you. He knows that to make you like him, you'll have to wait for stuff. And
Yeah.
so you practice waiting for stuff by waiting for stuff. It's really that simple, even though we're almost offended by the truth of waiting for things. But I think the second piece of it is, and I'm kicking myself. I wasn't able to find it, so maybe I'll flip a little bit now. Um, in Isaiah, where it says, a farmer doesn't plow continually. He plows and then he waits and he allows the earth to settle. He allows life to do its thing. And I think in the same way, maybe in
Isaiah 28:24.
28, 24, oh, I'm right there. So, yeah, perfect. Do those who plow for sowing plow continually? Do they continually open and harrow the ground? Or when they have leveled its surface, do they not scatter the dill, sow the cumin, and plant wheat in rows, barley in its proper place, and spelt as the border? For they are well instructed. Their God teaches them. And so he's just saying, that's what you do. That's how you farm. It's just the way it works. And I'm going to go back. It's almost a running joke now. Maybe someone at some point will go through and count the times that we allude to the most important parable in all of the kingdom, the parable of Mark 4, the good soil, that your heart is that soil. It's the same seed that goes in, his incorruptible seed. And yet it's not a question of what seed goes in. It's the condition of the soil and the treatment of the seed when it's there. So,
And I like that first part of that. Does he dig it back up?
yeah,
That's what we
exactly.
do so often.
And again, we talked about this before getting online. The Lord knows his love is so immense for us that whenever he's teaching us, there is 0%. You don't get this yet, you
Zero.
idiot. You
Yeah.
don't see it. And so often we talk to ourselves that way, but in humans, like we fully expect, you know what, you're right. I've made this mistake 36 times. I don't blame you for being fed up with me, but he's not like that still. And so after all this time, he's still patient with you as though it's the first time he's talking to you about it. And I think I say that because my tendency, sort of the multi-layered lesson that I'm in right now, is to be really frustrated. I've put this off before. You've told me about this. I see this in my life. And to recognize the wisdom of him building something for the purpose of it being eternal is different than our humanness and wanting to build something for its immediacy. That's what I was going to say before. He's not surprised at our human tendency, who you and your 60 years of life experience and me and my 30 years, he knows that 30 years is a blip, and yet it feels like I've lived a long time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so my idea of waiting for the next 6 months for fruit is totally different than his. 6 months is like I could blink and
Yeah.
the fruit is there. And the longer you're with him, the more you start to see that in your own life. But I say it because the early and the late rains representative of me feeling like, dude, didn't we do this before? And he's reminded me, yeah. And those were the early
Hmm.
rains. And that's wonderful. And they're perfect. And yet the late rains are equally necessary. It's part of it. And so don't be offended at this process. In fact, as James says earlier, count it all joy. You are entering some late rains. And I feel the need to preface with this. In our human tendency, my own human tendency, I tend to prefer the one walk dog. Oh, perfect. These are the rains. And after this, we'll be done.
Yeah,
And these are the late rains compared to the early rains I felt previously. These rains right now are early rains for subsequent later rains that will
it's
inevitably keep perpetuating, not because he wants me to suffer, not because I don't get it yet, but because the other verse that I have brought up is from Ezekiel chapter 47, where, we've alluded to this before, verse 12. On the banks, on both sides of the river, there will grow all kinds of trees. Their leaves will not wither, nor their fruit fail, but they will bear fresh fruit every month, or in every season in some translations, because the water for them flows from the sanctuary. Their fruit will be for food and their leaves for healing. That the rain is part of living in an environment that has water around. If you want the desert, you get the whole desert. And he says, I'll make a highway for you in the desert. I'll make water flow there. I mean, he made water come from a rock for the Israelites. And yet, I know I'm kind of getting far afield. I feel myself, the thought keeps expanding in me. All that to say, you are the tree. And so don't be offended that the quote rain doesn't stop. And I know that that's challenging, but when Jesus said the broad way that leads to destruction is easy and the narrow way that leads to life is hard, he's not kind of setting a bar. He's not making it this competition thing. I can do it and you can't. He's saying when you come to recognize that the way of being in this earth before eternity is to go through the fiery ordeal and be made perfect through it. I think it says in Hebrews, maybe Romans, that understandably, the pioneer of our faith, Jesus, was perfected through suffering to show us that perfection can come through suffering. And I don't mean that as an omen. And you and I've talked about this, the sort of play on words almost of choosing his way. There is no death on the path of life. It says that, I think, in Psalms or Proverbs. But his way does include suffering, suffering as Christ did, picking up your cross every day. And I think that's part of our intellect wants to categorize it one way or the other. Suffering is bad. No, 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 wait, suffering is good. No, 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 wait, suffering is bad. When you are made in his image, that you can hold both of those seeming opposites at the same time and walk through it gracefully. So I know I just kind of word vomited a lot there, and my apologies to you and the listeners, but
no, I
tell
love it.
me tell
No,
me what's
that's
on your
good.
mind.
Well, I mean, if you read on, it kind of tells us how to do it.
Read
Um,
on in
read on in
James.
James. It says, uh, well, I mean, you already read it earlier, but in the eighth uh, verse, this is in my translations, which I think is New King James. You also be patient, establish your hearts, for the
Mm,
coming of the Lord is at hand.
yeah.
And that's the process of establishing your heart. So we got a new heart when we
Hmm.
were born again, but we have the old heart's memories. We have the
Mm,
old heart's opinions. We have the old heart's ideas about stuff.
mm,
So we have to establish the truth that's in that new heart that we got, the truth of who we are in him
Mm,
as one with him. And that just takes time sometimes.
yep.
Not all the time. I mean,
Right.
sometimes it's instant. I don't want to, excuse me. Um, I don't want to, infer that this is always a long process. I
Hmm.
mean,
Hmm.
that later rains and early rains can be this very same hour, the very same
Exactly.
day.
Exactly. I know we were kind of joking this morning. Um, I like I said, I'm sort of experiencing the rains. And so in a way, waking up this morning and I'm like, oh great, a rainy day. And yet connecting with him and really being again, I'll just say open and honest about what I'm experiencing, but the openness to learn through it, which is, I think, what Paul's ultimately saying, put off the old, put on the new, that when it tells us in Proverbs 3, lean not on your own understanding, that is wisdom, but it's a necessity for your walk with the Lord. Not because you're an idiot and you don't get it, but because his ways are higher than your ways. His thoughts are higher than the earth's thoughts. And he's made a way that you can think the same way he does and have the same thoughts that he does now. But it's made harder when you try to bring the world's frame of reference, your own frame of reference with you. Like when you were saying, the old heart, we often talk about spirit, soul, body. Those are sort of the three pieces of you. And yet, in a way, they're like Venn diagrams, rings that are connected with overlapping portions. In a way, they're like lenses in a magnifying glass where they progress down through into different realms, so to speak.
Mhm.
Um, and so, both of those being true, what's true about your soul is that piece of you will stay with you forever. Your soul is like your fingerprint in the cosmos. When God created you, knew you in your mother's womb, knit you together when he conceived of you in his mind and then spoke you into existence, the sound that he made is your true sound. And so I think what we're talking about is being established through his process as that sound, as the new heart, overlaid with the soul, your memories, what you have experienced, and what you are yet to experience. And like you said, the establishing of your heart, if it could happen in a blink of an eye, which it's painful to say this, but 100 years on earth is just that in the scheme of eternity, a blink of an eye. And
Mhm.
boy, how worth it will we consider our 100 years here when we see the fruit that comes with the early and the late rains of our time and how much they translate into eternity in ways that we don't even have the words yet to thank him for. Like, oh my gosh, I had no idea that was coming down the pipeline, but you
Mhm.
did. And so you made me learn this lesson for that 6 months, for that 10 years, for that 50 years. That's really challenging to say because again, we take our own perception of what's good and evil about the lesson itself. We take our own perception of how we're experiencing life. Is this fun for me or not? Is this comfortable?
Good or bad.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And so, in that same way, the early and the late rains, the again, mine says strengthen your heart, but I like yours better. Establish your heart that he's building a foundation in you. I've heard it taught before that, the gospel says the Lord comes and makes his home in you. And for many people, they think that that means God comes in and is their roommate. And there's truth in that. But God brings his holiness with him. And so he's not going to stay in a one room shack forever. He is
Mm,
building the equivalent of what took David 20 years to build in Jerusalem, or rather, Solomon 20 years to build in Jerusalem, that temple for the Lord to occupy, to be worthy of him occupying. He's doing the same work in you because not only is that worthy of him calling it home, but he sees you in a way that you don't see you yet, which is also worthy of calling that palace home. And
yeah,
so you don't want a palace that was built in 2 days. Like no disrespect to Burning Man, but they go assemble that city in a week and take it down in 3 days. And the only proof that it was ever there is the pictures. The perpetual establishment that he's building in you cannot be disassembled in 3 days. And so it's worth it to go the long way. It's worth it for this narrow path that leads to life, not because of some promise of eternal reward, but within your lifetime, in your days in the land of the living, you will see his goodness, and he delights in the prosperity of his saints. That is it's in the Passion Translation, I think, but he delights in seeing us delight. And so knowing that us living in a palace will delight more in that than another way, he says, trust me, let the late rains and the early rains both have their way with you. Again, I know I'm kind of pulling from a lot of different places, but I think most of us by now can keep up. If you're with us at episode 46, then
yeah.
you're used to it at least in a little bit.
Well, that I think also is the beauty of the word, right? When you really start to read it, like, and uh, it comes alive to you, you are reminded of, oh, he says it here, he says it here. It's
Right.
he,
Right.
he talks a lot about it so that we get it. But that's a good point. Establishing your heart sometimes does take repetitive behavior. It
Mm,
sometimes takes reading a passage and seeing it in a different way and having it come alive in your heart in a different way.
mm,
So we've talked about some of those how to's before about putting off and putting on, but meditation and pondering this truth is how you establish it
mm.
in your heart, and then it
Right.
becomes a part of you. And I want to encourage those that, once it becomes established in your heart, it's effortless.
Mm. Dude,
that's
Jim
that's the
has one of the
cool.
best teachings on that I've heard,
Yeah,
as far as, picture you got a car and the car's kind of old and run down, and one day your car just stops working. You still got to go to work. You still have, obligations and such. And so for that first day you walk, and when it comes time to be the weekend, you're kind of tired. You don't feel like working on your car. And yet, not working on your car on the weekend means that you'll walk again for the next 5 days of work next week and the 5 days after that. And so the pain, if you will, of working on the car gets you to the point where now that it's fixed, you can drive it into work. And so that time that you spent putting the car back together is time that you don't have to spend walking all the days of the future. And where that
yeah,
analogy still falls short is that's still a human made vehicle. So it will
yeah,
still eventually start to decay. The spirit that he has put within you can run the race without fainting. It
yes,
can do all things for all time because it's of him and in his image. And so you doing the work to, as we were talking about, get the soul and body into alignment with this new heart truth. That alignment process, I think I've mentioned this to you before, how I have often pictured it is There was a book when we were growing up, the um, rainbow fish or something like that. And it's this beautiful fish, like a rainbow fish in the sea. And you can see that each one of their scales is uh, translucent, or that's not the word, translucent, like a prism. And
Yeah.
so it's a rainbow fish because from all angles, light is hitting all its scales at all different angles. So you see all of the visible spectrum of color across its entire body when the light catches it right. And so the spirit that he's put within you is this perfect prism that perfectly reflects his light, and your soul and your body are like individual fish scales on every single layer. And so he's so meticulous. He goes through and he gets each one properly aligned, properly sewn in. And as you said, there are times where it feels like he took his hand and swiped 15 of them at the same time and made them all go the right way. And there are times where it feels like 6 weeks go by and he's still in the process of flipping over one. And so I didn't mean to steal your thunder with that, but to your point, that doing the work to get that aligned is hard on the front end, but that's why the kingdom is like a seed, because you plant it, you go to bed, you wake up and it's somehow grown. So you participating in the planting, you participating in clearing out the debris, you participating in not letting thorns and thistles choke it out because you seek other things instead of letting it. You accepting the fact that there are early and late rains. And so when you start to feel them, you say, okay, come on, rain. And you might even find yourself dancing in the rain. That's what James was doing. But anyways, I
Yeah.
digress again. So yeah, as you were saying, once you get it, the work is done. And that's not to say again,
Well,
it's a
I
one
mean,
walk
layers.
dog,
Well, again,
but
yeah, I was going to
yeah.
remind because there are layers to, and
Hmm.
so you think you did the work, but there's a maybe a little bit deeper layer that is also transformed at a later
Hmm.
date.
Yeah.
But and I think that that should be taught more, when
Mm,
people really when they sign up to walk with God. This is a it's a process. It's a
mm,
lifestyle. It
hmm.
you will always be being transformed if you choose to participate
Right. Yeah, I think
into him,
it's
transformed into his image.
well, and that's it right there, is that's why on this side of heaven there will always be, quote, more that you could do, because until you're transfigured glowing at will and can trans relocate and are relatively omnipresent, you can still look more like him.
Yeah.
And so that's okay if that's the standard.
Yeah.
I mean, we should usher that in eventually. Paul was even to some of the early churches, he's like, you don't get this yet? Do we have to go back to the basics of raising people from the dead and healing the sick? I mean, come on, guys. Um, but yeah, it's funny. The last verse that to kind of wrap it all up, so to speak, is from Revelation chapter 7. And I'm going to skip around a little bit just because in the effort of time, starting at verse 9, but finishing at verse 15. This is again the disciple John describing his vision. He says, after this I looked, and there was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, robed in white, with palm branches in their hand. Then one of the elders dressed me. I'm skipping to 13. One of the elders addressed me and said, who are these robed in white, and where have they come from? And I said to him, sir, you are the one that knows. He said to me, these are they who have come out of the great ordeal. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. And I think about how when we talk about layers, on the lowest or the highest layer, however you choose to see it, you have been born again. Your robe has been washed. You can choose to participate and keep washing that thing and keep washing that thing. And on the one hand, you are building up the body by doing that. And the other hand, you are becoming more like him and in his image. And I think the word that stood out to me is have come out of the great ordeal, that this life sentence that is our life here is not a sentence. It is, in the one hand, being sent to army boot camp because it prepares you for what life as a son of God will be like, but does so in a much harder way, hopefully, than you'll experience, so that the real thing is easy compared to your training. On the other hand, it is an invitation. You don't have to participate. If you say, I'm going to live under a bridge, he'll still love you just the same. But you get to choose who he is. And in a way, you get to choose. I think I've encouraged people before, if you read the letters that Christ writes to the churches at the beginning of Revelation, at the end of every one, he says, those who overcome will receive X or will do X. And this is not carrot and the stick, the way we think of punishment and reward. It is, in the kingdom, everything is everyone's. But some people have no cities, and some people have 5 cities, and some people have 10 cities. And if it's in your heart to look over 10 cities, then you will go through more of an ordeal than those who just want to live in the land. And both of them are totally fine. I don't even say that with a hint of guilting you into picking one over the other. I'm saying it because part of this great ordeal that we are in is to allow the early and the late rains. And when you become a follower of Christ, it's more than just calling yourself a Christian. It's more than just having a community of like-minded people and believers around you. In truth, it's a one-on-one thing that happens just between you and him. And when I said at the beginning that the Lord speaks, and that sound that is you, your fingerprint in the cosmos, he sees you as the completed version of that, the one that looks like that and exactly like him. And so he'll see you and treat you that way if you accept that gift and speaking over you. And knowing, like you said, that we don't really teach that that means there will be early and late rains. There will be times it feels certainly like a great fiery ordeal. But to encourage you to know that your reward isn't just in eternity. Your reward can be experienced and will be experienced on this side of heaven in fruit that you couldn't ask, think, or imagine.
Yeah. Well, when we start talking about this process, a lot of people with may have a mindset of, like you said, reward, carrot and stick, or
Mm-hmm.
reward and punishment. But this is after you you're already saved. This is a process that you go through. You've already got the white robe, as you said.
Totally.
This isn't to make you righteous.
Mm,
It's to help you look more like him,
amen.
help you transform into his image. And
That's well
like,
said.
I like it, how you said it. Are you glowing yet? Because that, you know,
There
you
might still
still
be
have
room.
quote,
Yep.
you have quote work to do. But again, that doesn't make you righteous. This work,
Yes.
you're already righteous. You already have everything, and that is a gift because of what Jesus did.
Yeah.
But the transformation that you can enjoy and have, be an overcomer on this earth, and
Mm,
overcome some of the things that we are confronted with in this realm, if you
Hmm.
will.
Yeah.
You can
Yeah.
walk
That's
through it with him and in peace rather than the conflict that you experienced before it.
totally. Yeah. That's really well said and puts a cherry on it nicely. So I think we'll end it there. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you again next time.
Great. Blessings. Bye.